You pour your heart into projects only to watch them crumble despite your best efforts, and the disappointment crushes your spirit every single time. You find yourself lying awake at night, replaying failures and obsessing over results you cannot control, while anxiety about future outcomes paralyzes your present actions. I am Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor who ruled the most powerful empire in history while maintaining inner peace through the darkest plagues, bloodiest wars, and heaviest burdens of leadership. The Stoic principles I'll share will free you from the prison of attachment to outcomes, giving you the unshakable inner strength that comes from focusing on what you can control rather than what you cannot. Whether you're governing an empire or managing your career, the path to true freedom lies in releasing your desperate grip on results while doubling down on your effort and virtue. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom that has guided leaders for 2 millennia, and comment where you're watching from. Want to see how far the need for this liberation has spread across our modern world? I never wanted to be emperor. When Antoninus Pius adopted me, I thought I understood what lay ahead: responsibility, certainly, but also the power to shape Rome according to my philosophical ideals. How naive I was! The purple cloak they draped across my shoulders on that March day in 161 AD felt heavier than any armor I'd ever worn in battle. In my first weeks as emperor, I attacked every problem with the fervor of a man who believed that good intentions and hard work could solve anything. The empire was vast, complex, and filled with people whose suffering I desperately wanted to alleviate. I stayed awake through countless nights, poring over reports from distant provinces, trying to micromanage solutions to famines in Egypt, barbarian incursions along the Rhine, and political corruption in the Senate. I remember one particular evening when news arrived that a grain shipment to Alexandria had been delayed by storms, leaving thousands without food. I immediately summoned my advisors, demanding to know why we hadn't anticipated this, why our backup plans had failed, why people were suffering when I had the resources of an empire at my disposal. My anger wasn't directed at my staff, was directed at the universe itself for not bending to my will. That night, I realized something that would take years to fully understand. Even with unlimited power, I could not control outcomes. I could dispatch ships, but I could not command the winds. I could issue edicts, but I could not guarantee they would be followed. I could love my people with every fiber of my being, but I could not prevent their suffering. The weight of this realization nearly crushed me. I had spent my youth studying philosophy, believing that wisdom and virtue would naturally lead to good results. Now, faced with the actual machinery of governance, I discovered that the gap between intention and outcome was an abyss that no amount of effort could bridge. I began to understand why so many emperors before me had become tyrants or madmen. When you believe that controlling outcomes is your responsibility, every failure becomes a personal indictment. Every famine, every defeat, every citizen's death feels like evidence of your inadequacy. The temptation is to grasp for more control, to become more rigid in your demands, to punish those who fail to deliver the results you desperately need. But something in my philosophical training whispered a different possibility. What if my responsibility wasn't to control outcomes, but to control something else entirely? What if the very attachment to results was the source of my suffering? In those early months, I learned to distinguish between the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who bore responsibility for Rome's welfare, and the man Marcus Aurelius, who could only control his own thoughts, decisions, and actions. The emperor might fail to prevent a plague or defeat every enemy, but the man could choose to respond with wisdom, courage, and justice regardless of the circumstances. This distinction became my lifeline. When reports arrived of setbacks or tragedies, I trained myself to ask not how can I fix this, but rather how can I respond to this with virtue. The shift was subtle but revolutionary. Instead of measuring myself by outcomes I could not control, I began measuring myself by the quality of my effort and the integrity of my response. The purple cloak remained heavy, but I learned to carry its weight differently. I still cared deeply about Rome's welfare, but I released my desperate grip on guaranteeing specific results. I discovered that this release didn't make me a worse emperor, it made me a better one. When you're not paralyzed by attachment to outcomes, you can act more decisively, think more clearly, and lead with the kind of calm authority that inspires confidence in others. Asterisk, the plague that swept through Rome during my reign was my greatest teacher in the futility of attachment to outcomes. It arrived in 165 AD, brought back by my armies, returning from the Parthian campaigns, and it would rage for 15 years. I have never felt so powerless in my life. Picture this. You are the most powerful man in the world, with unlimited resources at your disposal, and yet you watch helplessly as disease cuts through your people like a scythe through wheat. I summoned the best physicians from across the empire, consulted every medical text in our libraries, offered prayers to every god in our pantheon, and still the death toll mounted daily. I remember walking through the streets of Rome, seeing the funeral pyres burning day and night, watching families carry out their dead, and feeling the crushing weight of my own inadequacy. My first instinct was to do more more edicts, spend more money, find more doctors, organize more relief efforts. I was like a man trying to stop a river with his bare hands. In those dark months, I witnessed something that fundamentally changed my understanding of human suffering and divine providence. I saw wealthy Romans die despite having access to the finest care, while some poor citizens somehow survived in squalid conditions. I watched virtuous, pious families lose every member while corrupt officials inexplicably remained healthy. The plague respected neither rank nor virtue nor any human conception of fairness. This randomness should have driven me to despair or rage, but instead it became my liberation. I finally understood what my Stoic teachers had tried to tell me. We live in a universe where outcomes are fundamentally beyond our control. Health and sickness, life and death, success and failure, these things come and go according to forces far greater than any human will. But here's what I discovered in the midst of that horror. While I could not control who lived or died, I could control how I responded to each death. While I could not stop the plague, I could choose to remain present with my people rather than fleeing to safety. While I could not guarantee that my relief efforts would save any particular person, I could ensure that every effort was made with genuine compassion and wisdom. Learned to measure my success not by the number of lives saved, a metric that would have driven me insane, but by the quality of care we provided, the dignity with which we treated both the living and the dead, and the steadiness of my own character under unimaginable pressure. One evening, as I sat beside the bedside of a dying senator's child, her father grabbed my arm and whispered desperately, "Caesar, surely you can do something. You have the power of the gods." In that moment, I could have lied to comfort him, or made promises I couldn't keep, or shared his desperate attachment to an outcome I could not control. Instead, I told him the truth. I have done everything within my power, but there are limits to what any mortal can control. What I can promise is that we will not abandon you, that your daughter's suffering matters to me as much as if she were my own child, and that whether she lives or dies, she will be cared for with love. The child died that night, but something remarkable happened. Instead of rage or despair, her father found a kind of peace in knowing that everything possible had been done with genuine care. He thanked me not for saving her life, but for honoring her dignity and sharing his grief. This became my approach to every aspect of imperial duty during the plague years. I could not control the disease, but I could control my response to it. I could not save everyone, but I could ensure that no one suffered alone if I could help it. I could not prevent death, but I could model how to face it with courage and grace. The plague taught me that attachment to outcomes is not just futile, it's actively harmful. When you're desperately clinging to results you cannot control, you become rigid, anxious, and unable to respond with the flexibility and presence that difficult situations require. When you release that attachment, you become available for whatever each moment actually demands of you. By the time the plague finally subsided, I had learned to find peace in uncertainty and strength in acceptance. The disease had taken hundreds of thousands of lives, including some people I loved dearly, but it had also taught me the most valuable lesson of my reign. True power lies not in controlling outcomes, but in maintaining virtue regardless of circumstances. The Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier taught me lessons about attachment that no philosophy classroom ever could. For years, I campaigned against the Marcomanni, the Quadi and their allies, sleeping in a simple tent while rain drummed against the lever. Walls and enemy campfires dotted the distant hills. War is perhaps the ultimate arena for testing one's attachment to outcomes. Every general goes into battle with a plan, every soldier with hopes of victory and survival, every emperor with dreams of decisive triumph that will secure the frontier forever. Yet war has a way of mocking all such attachments. I remember one particular engagement where we had planned for months. Our intelligence was excellent, our positioning was perfect, our troops were well trained and motivated. Everything suggested certain victory. Yet when dawn broke and the battle commenced, nothing unfolded as expected. The enemy had anticipated our strategy, the weather turned against us, and what should have been a swift victory became a grinding, bloody stalemate. Sitting in my tent that evening, treating wounded soldiers and receiving reports of heavy casualties, I felt the familiar rage of attachment rising in my chest. I had done everything right, so why hadn't the universe cooperated? Why did good planning and virtuous intentions not guarantee good results? It was during these campaigns that I began writing what would become my meditations. Each evening, by lamplight, I would record my thoughts on the day's events, trying to make sense of the gap between effort and outcome, between intention and result. These weren't meant for publication, they were my private conversations with myself, my attempts to understand how to maintain inner peace while surrounded by chaos. One entry I wrote during a particularly difficult siege captures my evolving understanding. The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it. I cannot control whether the enemy surrenders tomorrow, but I can control whether I approach tomorrow's challenges with wisdom and courage. The battlefield became my laboratory for practicing non-attachment. Before each engagement, I would prepare, thoroughly studying maps, consulting with my generals, ensuring our troops were ready. But I also began preparing myself mentally for any outcome. Victory was preferable, certainly, but my peace of mind could not depend on it. I learned to find satisfaction in the quality of our preparation, rather than demanding specific results. When our strategies succeeded, I felt gratitude rather than pride. When they failed, I felt disappointment, but not despair. The key was recognizing that my duty was to make the best decisions I could with the information available, not to guarantee that those decisions would always produce the outcomes I desired. This shift in perspective made me a better military commander. When you're not desperately attached to winning every engagement, you can think more clearly about which battles are worth fighting and which are worth avoiding. You can adapt more quickly when circumstances change. You can maintain the kind of steady leadership that keeps an army together through both victories and defeats. I noticed that my soldiers began to respond differently to my leadership as well. There's something contagious about genuine inner peace. When a commander is not frantically grasping for control, his men feel more secure and confident. They trust that decisions are being made from wisdom rather than from desperate attachment to specific outcomes. The Germanic tribes were formidable enemies, and our campaigns stretched on for years. There were victories and defeats, advances and retreats, moments of hope and periods of seemingly intractable difficulty. But through it all, I learned to maintain what I came to think of as detached engagement, caring deeply about the welfare of my men and the security of Rome, while releasing my grip on controlling exactly how that care and concern would manifest in results. One night, after a particularly brutal day of fighting, a young centurion asked me how I could remain so calm when so much was at stake. I told him that everything was always at stake. That was the nature of life itself. Peace didn't come from reducing the stakes, but from accepting that outcomes would always be partially beyond our control. Then what's the point of trying? He asked. I pointed to the wounded soldiers we were tending. The point is that our effort matters, even when we can't control its results. These men need care whether we win or lose tomorrow. Your courage inspires others, whether the battle goes our way or not. We act because action in service of good is inherently valuable, not because we can guarantee specific outcomes. By the end of those campaigns, I had learned that the battlefield offers a perfect metaphor for all of life. We prepare, we engage, we give our best effort, and then we accept whatever results emerge. Victory is sweet when it comes, but our inner peace cannot depend on it. Defeat is bitter, but it need not destroy us if our self-worth is rooted in something deeper than outcomes. The Germanic frontier was never permanently secured during my lifetime. That was an outcome beyond any emperor's control. But those campaigns taught me how to find peace within uncertainty, strength within vulnerability, and purpose within impermanence. These lessons would serve me well in every challenge that followed. My teacher Epictetus, though I never met him personally, taught me the most liberating truth I have ever learned. There are things within our control and things beyond our control, and wisdom lies in understanding the difference. But knowing this intellectually and living it practically are vastly different challenges. Epictetus had been a slave, which gave him a unique perspective on powerlessness that no freeborn Roman could fully appreciate. When you have experienced the ultimate loss of control over your external circumstances, you understand with brutal clarity that your inner freedom is the only freedom that truly matters. His teachings on the discipline of desire became the foundation of my own liberation from outcome attachment. The discipline of desire means training yourself to want only what is entirely within your power to achieve. This sounds simple, but it requires a complete reorganization of how most people think about satisfaction and success. We are naturally inclined to desire specific outcomes: health, wealth, recognition, love from particular people, success in particular endeavors. But all of these outcomes depend on factors beyond our control. I began practicing this discipline during my daily morning reflections. I would examine my desires and intentions for the day, asking myself, is this something I can actually control, or am I setting myself up for frustration by demanding that the universe comply with my preferences? For example, I might naturally desire that a particular peace negotiation with tribal leaders would be successful, but the success of that negotiation depends on their willingness to compromise, their internal political pressures, circumstances I know nothing about, and countless other variables beyond my influence. If I attach my peace of mind to that specific outcome, I am guaranteed to suffer instead. I learned to desire only what was genuinely within my control, that I would approach the negotiation with wisdom, fairness, and genuine respect for all parties involved, that I would listen carefully, speak truthfully, and make decisions based on what seemed best for Rome's long-term interests, that I would maintain my composure and dignity regardless of how others behaved. This shift from outcome desire To process desires was revolutionary for my inner peace. I could satisfy these deeper desires completely, regardless of external circumstances. Even if the negotiation failed, even if the tribal leaders were unreasonable or hostile, even if the entire diplomatic effort collapsed, I could still achieve everything I had genuinely desired to conduct myself with virtue and wisdom. The discipline of desire doesn't mean becoming passive or indifferent to outcomes. I still had strong preferences about how I wanted things to turn out. I still worked tirelessly to achieve the best possible results for Rome and its people. But I learned to hold these preferences lightly, as hopes rather than demands. This distinction between preferring and demanding became crucial to my mental freedom. When I preferred that a particular policy would succeed but didn't demand it, I could work toward that success with full energy while remaining internally peaceful about whatever actually occurred. When I demanded specific outcomes, I became anxious, rigid, and ultimately less effective in my efforts. I practiced this discipline in matters both great and small. When meeting with senators who opposed my policies, I desired only that I would present my arguments clearly and listen to their concerns with genuine openness. Whether they were persuaded was beyond my control. When dealing with natural disasters, I desired only that our response would be swift, well-organized, and genuinely helpful to those affected. Whether the disasters would be completely resolved was not mine to determine. The most challenging aspect of this practice was learning to apply it to people I loved. I desperately wanted my children to be healthy, my wife to be happy, my friends to prosper. But wanting these things in a grasping, demanding way only created suffering for both myself and them. I had to learn to love people without trying to control their outcomes. This meant supporting my children's growth while accepting that they might face setbacks and sorrows I could not prevent. It meant caring for my wife's well-being while recognizing that her happiness ultimately depended on factors beyond my ability to manage. It meant offering friendship and guidance while releasing attachment to how others chose to live their lives. The discipline of desire taught me that genuine love actually requires non-attachment to outcomes. When you love someone without demanding that they conform to your vision of what would be best for them, you can offer support and wisdom without the desperation that makes both love and help less effective. Over years of practice, I discovered that this discipline didn't diminish my care or reduce my effectiveness. Instead, it freed me to engage more fully with whatever each moment required. When you're not mentally defending against outcomes you cannot control, you have more energy available for responding wisely to what is actually happening. The discipline of desire became the foundation for every other aspect of my philosophy. Once you truly understand that your well-being depends only on your own choices and responses, you discover a freedom that no external circumstances can touch. This is the beginning of what I came to think of as the inner citadel, unassailable fortress of peace that you can retreat to regardless of what storms may rage outside. Each morning, before the palace stirred to life, I would sit by my window facing east and prepare my mind for the day ahead. This wasn't mere routine, it was essential training in the art of non-attachment. I learned that how you begin each day determines whether you'll face its challenges with wisdom or react to them with desperate grasping. My morning reflections always began with what I called the inventory of the uncontrollable. I would mentally review everything that might happen. That day that lay beyond my influence. The weather might turn stormy, affecting grain shipments. Senators might oppose legislation I considered vital. Messengers might arrive with news of military defeats. Illness might strike people I cared about. My own body might betray me with pain or fatigue. This wasn't pessimistic thinking, it was realistic preparation. By acknowledging in advance that disappointing outcomes were not only possible but inevitable in human affairs, I could approach each day without the brittle expectations that lead to frustration and despair. I developed specific meditation techniques for releasing attachment to the day's potential outcomes. One practice involved imagining myself at the end of the day, reviewing events that had unfolded differently than I had hoped. I would visualize maintaining my composure, responding with wisdom, and finding meaning in whatever had actually occurred, rather than mourning what had not. For instance, I might imagine that a diplomatic mission I had carefully planned would fail completely. Rather than visualizing this as a catastrophe, I would practice viewing it as an opportunity to demonstrate resilience, to learn something new about negotiation, or to discover alternative approaches I had not previously considered. By mentally rehearsing acceptance before attachment could form, I found it much easier to maintain equanimity when setbacks actually occurred. Another morning practice involved what I called preferential no-attachment. I would acknowledge my genuine preferences for the day, that meetings would go smoothly, that reports would contain good news, that no crises would emerge requiring immediate attention, while explicitly releasing any demand that these preferences be satisfied. I would say to myself, I prefer that today's activities unfold smoothly, but I do not require this for my peace of mind. If challenges arise, I will meet them with whatever wisdom I possess. If disappointments come, I will find in them opportunities for growth and service. My well-being depends not on what happens to me, but on how I choose to respond to what happens. This practice of preferential non-attachment was delicate work. The goal wasn't to become indifferent to outcomes. Caring about results is natural and often appropriate. Rather, I was training myself to care without clinging, to hope without demanding, to work toward goals without making my inner peace contingent upon achieving them. I also used my morning reflections to practice what I called dignified preparation. This meant ensuring that, regardless of what the day might bring, I would be ready to respond in a manner consistent with my values and philosophy. I would review the virtues I wanted to embody: courage in the face of danger, justice in dealing with conflicts, temperance in managing desires, and wisdom in making decisions. The key insight was that I could guarantee my own virtue regardless of circumstances, but I could not guarantee external outcomes no matter how virtuously I behaved. A just decision might still lead to unpopular results. A courageous action might still end in failure. A wise policy might still be undermined by factors beyond my knowledge or control. By focusing my morning intentions on being the kind of person I wanted to be, rather than on achieving specific results, I set myself up for success that was genuinely within my power. I could always choose to be just, regardless of whether justice prevailed. I could always choose to be courageous, regardless of whether courage led to victory. I could always choose to be wise, regardless of whether wisdom produced the outcomes I preferred. One particularly powerful morning practice involved contemplating my own mortality. I would remind myself that this day might be my last, that every conversation might be a final conversation, that every decision might be among my final acts. This wasn't morbid thinking, it was clarifying thinking. When you truly accept that your time is limited and uncertain, it becomes much easier to focus on what actually matters, rather than becoming consumed with controlling outcomes that may be irrelevant in the larger scheme of things. These morning reflections prepared me to greet each day's events with what I came to think of as interested detachment. I remained fully engaged with my responsibilities and genuinely concerned about their outcomes, but I held this engagement lightly, ready to adapt when circumstances shifted in unexpected directions. By the time the palace began to wake and my daily duties commenced, I had already accomplished the most important work of the day, preparing my mind to remain free, regardless of what external events might unfold. This inner preparation proved more valuable than any external planning. because it equipped me to respond wisely to whatever actually occurred, rather than wasting energy lamenting what had not. Asterisk, asterisk, during my years of studying fortress architecture throughout the empire, I became fascinated by the concept of an impregnable stronghold, a place of refuge that could withstand any siege. This architectural interest led me to a profound philosophical insight. Every person must construct within themselves an inner citadel that external circumstances cannot breach. The inner citadel is not a place of retreat from the world, but rather a foundation of unshakable strength from which you can engage fully with whatever life presents. It is built not from stone and mortar, but from the recognition that your essential self-your capacity for virtue, wisdom, and inner peace lies beyond the reach of any external force. I began constructing my own inner citadel by identifying exactly what belonged inside its walls and what must remain outside. Inside the citadel were my thoughts, judgments, choices, and responses, everything genuinely under my control. Outside were other people's actions, natural events, the outcomes of my efforts, and everything else that occurred independently of my will. This distinction required constant practice to maintain. My natural inclination, like most people's, was to include far too much within the citadel walls. I wanted to control not just my own actions, but their results. Not just my own behavior, but others' responses to it. Not just my own efforts, but the outcomes they produced. Learning to exclude these things from my inner sanctuary was perhaps the most difficult and liberating work of my life. The walls of the inner citadel are built from acceptance, not passive resignation, but active acknowledgement of what is actually within your power to influence. When you truly accept that certain things lie beyond your control, you stop wasting energy trying to control them and can redirect that energy toward what you actually can influence. For example, I could not control whether the Senate would approve my legislative proposals, but I could control how thoroughly I researched them, how clearly I presented them, and how respectfully I treated senators who disagreed with me. I could not control whether my military campaigns would succeed, but I could control the quality of my strategic planning, the care I took for my soldiers' welfare, and the honor with which I conducted warfare. The foundation of the inner citadel is the understanding that your worth as a person does not depend on external validation or achievement. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect for me as emperor, since my entire social role was defined by external success. But I learnt to distinguish between Marcus Aurelius, the emperor whose effectiveness could be measured by outcomes, and Marcus Aurelius, the human being whose worth was inherent and unshakable. This distinction allowed me to care deeply about my imperial responsibilities while maintaining inner peace regardless of their results. I could work tirelessly to serve Rome well without making my self-worth dependent on whether Rome prospered under my rule. I could face military defeats without feeling personally defeated, policy failures without feeling like a failure as a person. The inner citadel also houses what I came to think of as philosophical reserves, deep convictions about meaning and purpose that remain stable regardless of circumstances. Chief among these was my belief that virtue is the only true good, that acting with wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance has inherent value that no external event can diminish. When plague ravaged the empire, this philosophical reserve reminded me that my character was not determined by my ability to stop the disease, but by how I responded to those who suffered from it. When military campaigns dragged on longer than expected, I could find meaning in the steadiness of my leadership, rather than measuring myself solely by the speed of victory. The architecture of the inner citadel includes what I called emergency protocols, predetermined responses to the kinds of setbacks and disappointments that inevitably arise in any human life. Instead of being caught off guard by failure or loss, I had already decided how I would interpret and respond to such events. If a trusted advisor betrayed me, I would view it as an opportunity to practice forgiveness and learn something about human nature. If illness struck, I would see it as a chance to demonstrate grace under pressure and to appreciate whatever health remained. If death approached, I would treat it as the natural completion of life rather than as a catastrophe to be feared or resented. These protocols weren't fatalistic acceptance, they were strategic preparations that allowed me to maintain my values and effectiveness even when circumstances became difficult. By deciding in advance how I would respond to various challenges, I could react from wisdom rather than from panic or desperation. The inner citadel also contains what might be called portable satisfactions, sources of fulfillment that travel with you regardless of external circumstances. These include the satisfaction of effort itself, the joy of learning, the peace of acting according to your principles, and the contentment that comes from accepting life on its own terms. Unlike external satisfactions, wealth, fame, power, others, approval, these portable satisfactions cannot be taken from you by changing circumstances. They are available in any situation, at any time, to anyone willing to cultivate them. A person in prison can experience the satisfaction of maintaining dignity. A person facing failure can find joy in having given their best effort. A person confronting loss can discover peace in accepting what cannot be changed. The completed inner citadel becomes a place of refuge that you can access instantly, regardless of what chaos may surround you. In the middle of a heated Senate debate, I could retreat there to find the calm wisdom needed to respond effectively. During the worst days of the plague, I could find there the strength to continue serving those who suffered. On the battlefield, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, I could access the unshakable peace that comes from knowing that my essential self remained untouchable. This inner citadel became my greatest achievement as emperor, not because it helped me rule more effectively, though it did, but because it gave me a freedom that no external circumstance could threaten. It taught me that true security comes not from controlling your environment, but from constructing an inner foundation that no external storm can shake. I carry a small bronze coin in my pocket, marked with a skull, and the words, Memento Mori, remember death. Most people would find this morbid, but I have discovered that contemplating mortality is the fastest path to freedom from attachment to outcomes. When you truly accept that everything is temporary, including your own life, it becomes much easier to release your desperate grip on controlling what cannot be controlled. Death is the ultimate outcome that none of us can avoid, yet it is also the outcome over which we have the least control. We can influence the timing and manner of our death through our choices, but we cannot prevent it entirely, nor can we know when it will come. This makes death the perfect teacher for anyone seeking to understand the relationship between effort and outcome. Each morning, I spend time contemplating the reality that this day might be my last. This isn't pessimistic thinking, it's the most clarifying practice I know. When you genuinely accept that your time is limited and uncertain, your priorities become instantly clear, trivial concerns fade away, and what truly matters stands out with sharp relief. I think about the emperors who came before me: Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian. All once seemed as permanent and powerful as mountains, yet all returned to dust. Their achievements, their failures, their desperate attempts to control outcomes during their reigns, all of it is now simply history. This perspective helps me understand that my own efforts, however earnest, will eventually be subject to the same judgment of time. But here's what I learned from confronting mortality daily. The temporary nature of life doesn't make it meaningless, makes it precious in a way that permanence never could. When you know that your opportunities to act with virtue are limited, each choice to do good becomes more valuable, not less. During the plague years, death surrounded me constantly. I watched friends die, advisors die, even some of my own children die. Each loss was painful, but my daily contemplation of mortality had prepared me to face these losses without the kind of devastating attachment that destroys people who have never made peace with impermanence. Learned to view each person I loved as a temporary gift rather than a permanent possession. This didn't diminish my love for them, intensified it. When you know that every conversation might be your last with someone, you pay attention in a way that takes nothing for granted. When you accept that loss is inevitable, you can love without the desperate clinging that actually pushes people away. My contemplation of death also taught me to evaluate my daily decisions differently. Instead of asking, will this increase my power or advance my agenda, I began asking, if I die tonight, will I be proud of how I spent today? This shift in questioning led to very different choices about how to spend my time and energy. I started prioritizing actions that had meaning independent of their outcomes. Writing in my journal became more important than attending every social function. Spending time with my family became more valuable than working late into the night on policies that might or might not be implemented successfully. Treating each person I encountered with dignity became more significant than managing my public image. Death meditation taught me that our attachment to outcomes often stems from the illusion that we have unlimited time to achieve our goals. We become frantic about success because we believe we can eventually force the universe to comply with our desires. But when you accept that your time is finite and uncertain, you realize that peace must be found in the process itself, not in achieving specific end results. I practiced what I called deathbed perspective, imagining myself at the end of my life, looking back on various current concerns and asking whether they would seem important from that vantage point. Would I regret not being more worried about a particular political setback? Would I wish I had been more attached to the outcome of a specific military campaign? Almost always, the answer was no. From death's perspective, what mattered was not whether I had controlled outcomes, but whether I had lived with virtue and authenticity. Had I been just in my dealings? Had I been courageous in the face of difficulty? Had I treated others with compassion? Had I maintained my inner peace regardless of external circumstances? These questions had answers that were genuinely within my control. The awareness of mortality also helped me understand the proper relationship between effort and acceptance. Knowing that death could come at any time, I felt motivated to give my best effort to whatever task was before me, not because I could guarantee success, but because doing less than my best would be a waste of whatever time remained to me. Simultaneously, the certainty of eventual death helped me accept failures and setbacks with greater equanimity. In 100 years, no one would remember whether a particular policy had succeeded or failed, but the character I had developed in responding to that success or failure would be my lasting contribution to the moral fabric of the universe. I began to see death not as the enemy of life, but as life's most important advisor. Death whispers constantly, "This is temporary. These concerns that consume you will pass. What matters is how you choose to respond while you still can." The contemplation of death became my daily liberation from the tyranny of outcomes. When you know that everything, your empire, your achievements, your failures, your very existence is destined to pass away, you can engage with life more fully because you're not desperately trying to make anything permanent. This doesn't lead to nihilism or indifference. Instead, it leads to a kind of passionate engagement that is free from desperate attachment. I could work tirelessly for Rome's welfare while accepting that Rome itself would eventually fade. I could love my family deeply while knowing that separation was inevitable. I could pursue justice and wisdom while recognizing that my efforts were just brief contributions to an eternal human struggle. Death taught me the ultimate lesson in non-attachment. Everything you think you possess, your body, your relationships, your achievements, your very life, is actually on loan from the Universe, you can enjoy these gifts, care for them, and use them well, but you cannot keep them forever. Peace comes not from pretending otherwise, but from accepting this truth and finding meaning in temporary stewardship rather than permanent ownership. The Roman Senate provided me with a daily laboratory for practicing non-attachment to others' responses. Leading senators who fundamentally disagreed with my vision for the empire, who questioned my decisions publicly, and who sometimes seemed more interested in political maneuvering than in Rome's welfare, taught me lessons about human nature that no philosophy text could provide. My natural inclination, especially in my early years as emperor, was to want senators to like me, to approve of my policies, and to cooperate enthusiastically with my leadership. This desire for approval and cooperation created constant suffering, because other people's responses are fundamentally beyond your control. You can influence them through your actions and words, but you cannot determine them. I remember one particularly frustrating session where I had spent weeks crafting what I believed was a just and necessary policy reform. I presented it clearly, addressed obvious objections in advance, and offered reasonable compromises. Yet, several influential senators opposed it for what seemed to me to be purely partisan reasons, more concerned with maintaining their own power than with serving Rome's interests. My initial reaction was anger and disappointment. How could intelligent people be so unreasonable? How could they put personal advantage ahead of the common good? Why couldn't they see the obvious benefits of what I was proposing? I spent sleepless nights strategizing ways to pressure them, to change their minds, to force their cooperation. But then I realized that my frustration stemmed from attachment to an outcome. I could not control their approval and cooperation. I could control my own behavior in the Senate, the quality of my proposals, the respect with which I treated even those who disagreed with me, but I could not control their responses, and my peace of mind could not depend on winning them over. This realization led me to develop what I came to think of as principled detachment. In dealing with difficult people, I would continue to engage with them fully, to listen to their concerns, to explain my positions clearly, and to treat them with dignity. But I would not make my inner peace contingent on persuading them or earning their approval. The transformation in my approach was subtle but profound. Instead of entering Senate meetings with the desperate hope that everyone would finally see reason and support my proposals, I entered with the clear intention to represent my values and Rome's interests as well as I could, regardless of how others chose to respond. This shift actually made me more effective, not less. When you're not anxiously attached to getting specific responses from people, you can listen more carefully to what they're actually saying, rather than just waiting for them to agree with you. You can remain calm and thoughtful, even when others become heated or unreasonable. You can maintain your dignity and principles even in the face of personal attacks or unfair criticism. I applied this same approach to all my relationships. With my wife, I focused on being a loving and supportive husband while releasing attachment to controlling her moods or responses. With my children, I concentrated on providing guidance and care while accepting that their choices and character development were ultimately their own responsibility. With my advisors, I worked to create an environment where honest counsel could flourish, while recognizing that I could not force anyone to be wise or truthful. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of this practice was learning to respond to betrayal and ingratitude without becoming bitter or defensive. When people I had trusted acted against Rome's interests, when those I had helped showed no appreciation, when individuals I had treated fairly responded with hostility, my natural human reaction was hurt and anger. But I learned to see these experiences as opportunities to practice virtue without expecting virtue in return. If I could remain just even when others were unjust, courageous even when others were cowardly, and compassionate even when others were cruel, then my character was being strengthened rather than weakened by their poor behavior. This approach required me to find satisfaction in my own integrity rather than in others' recognition of it. I had to learn to be content with doing the right thing even when no one noticed, appreciated, or reciprocated. This was perhaps the most liberating discovery of my reign, that virtue is its own reward, independent of external acknowledgement. I also discovered that releasing attachment to others' responses actually improved my relationships rather than harming them. When people sense that you're not desperately trying to control their reactions, they often become more open and honest with you. When you can listen without defending, disagree without attacking, and remain steady in the face of their emotional turbulence, you create a space where genuine communication becomes possible. The senators who had seemed most difficult gradually began to respect this approach, even when they continued to disagree with my policies. Some became genuine allies over time, not because I had manipulated or pressured them, but because they had witnessed consistent integrity that invited their trust. Learning to engage with difficult people without attachment to their responses taught me that we can never control how others behave, but we can always control how we respond to their behavior. This understanding freed me from the exhausting cycle of trying to manage others' emotions and reactions, allowing me to focus my energy on what was actually within my power, my own choices, words, and actions. By the end of my reign, I had learned to find peace even in the midst of political opposition, personal criticism, and human unreasonableness, not because these things no longer bothered me, but because I had learned to ground my well-being in something deeper than others' approval or cooperation. The most challenging aspect of learning non-attachment was discovering how to love deeply while holding lightly. This seems contradictory. How can you genuinely care about someone or something without being attached to specific outcomes? Yet I found that true love actually requires the freedom that comes from releasing desperate control. I learned this lesson most painfully through the deaths of my children. Faustina and I lost several children during their early years, including our son Verus, who died at age 7, and our daughter Anya Lucilla, who lived only a few months. Each loss felt like a piece of my heart being torn away, yet these experiences taught me the difference between loving attachment and loving detachment. When Verus fell ill, my first instinct was to mobilize every resource at my disposal. I summoned the finest physicians in the empire, consulted every medical text available, even offered prayers to gods I wasn't sure I believed in. My love for him expressed itself through desperate attempts to control an outcome that was fundamentally beyond my power to determine. The intensity of my attachment made me less present with him during his final days, not more. I was so focused on finding a cure, so consumed with anxiety about losing him, that I struggled to simply be with him as he was. My love had become tangled with my ego's desperate need to succeed at saving him. After his death, I spent months torturing myself with questions about what I could have done differently. Should I have tried different treatments, consulted different doctors, moved him to a different climate? This self-torture was actually a form of attachment, clinging to the illusion that I could have controlled an outcome that was never within my power. Gradually, I learned to transform my love from desperate attachment into what I came to think of as loving presence. This meant caring deeply about someone's well-being, while accepting that their ultimate fate was not mine to determine. It meant offering support and care, while recognizing that suffering and loss are inherent parts of human existence, that love cannot prevent. With my remaining children, I practiced a different kind of engagement. I continued to care intensely about their welfare, to provide guidance and protection, to worry about their futures. But I held these concerns lightly, as expressions of love rather than as demands upon the universe. This shift allowed me to be more present with them rather than constantly anxious about potential threats to their happiness. when I wasn't mentally defending against all possible future losses. I could actually enjoy their company in the present moment. Paradoxically, releasing my attachment to keeping them safe forever made me a better father to them while they were with me. I applied this same principle to my role as emperor. I cared passionately about Rome's welfare, but I learned to hold this care without the desperate attachment that had made my early years in power so exhausting. I could work tirelessly for policies I believed would benefit the empire while accepting that some would fail and that Rome's ultimate destiny was beyond any single ruler's control. This detached caring made me more effective, not less. When you're not frantically trying to control outcomes, you can think more clearly about what actions are actually helpful. When you're not paralyzed by the fear of failure, you can take calculated risks that might lead to significant improvements. When you're not emotionally devastated by setbacks, you can learn from them and adjust your approach. The key insight was learning to distinguish between caring about someone or something and feeling responsible for their complete welfare. I could care deeply about a senator's well-being without feeling responsible for ensuring that he made wise decisions. I could love Rome passionately without believing that its prosperity depended entirely on my successful management. This distinction freed me from the impossible burden of trying to control outcomes for everyone and everything I cared about. It allowed me to offer my best efforts as gifts rather than as desperate attempts to prevent loss or guarantee success. I discovered that non-attached caring actually creates more space for others to flourish. When you're not constantly trying to manipulate outcomes for someone's benefit, they have more room to develop their own wisdom and strength. When you're not anxiously hovering over every detail of their lives, they can learn to handle challenges independently. My relationship with Faustina illustrated this beautifully. Early in our marriage, my love for her included a desire to shield her from every disappointment, to anticipate her needs before she expressed them, to create a perfect environment where she would always be happy. This kind of attached caring was actually suffocating for both of us. As I learned to love her without attachment to controlling her happiness, our relationship deepened. I could support her through difficulties without feeling responsible for preventing all difficulties. I could enjoy her company without constantly monitoring her mood. I could care about her well-being without making myself anxious about every aspect of her experience. This transformation in how I approached caring extended to my relationship with Rome itself. I came to see myself not as the empire's savior, responsible for guaranteeing its eternal prosperity, but as a temporary steward, offering my best service while I was able. This perspective allowed me to work with dedication while maintaining inner peace about outcomes I could not control. The paradox resolved itself. True caring requires the freedom that comes from non-attachment. When you love without clinging, support without controlling, and hope without demanding, you create space for genuine flourishing. When you release the desperate need to prevent all loss, you become available for whatever each moment actually offers, including moments of joy, connection, and meaning that desperate attachment often obscures. Caring without attachment became one of my most valuable discoveries as both emperor and human being. It allowed me to engage fully with life while maintaining the inner peace that comes from accepting life on its own terms rather than demanding that it conform to my preferences. The economic crisis that struck Rome during the latter part of my reign tested every principle of known attachment I had developed. Despite having access to the greatest minds and resources in the empire, I watched helplessly as inflation ravaged our currency, trade disruptions created shortages, and the costs of constant warfare drained our treasury beyond what our taxation could sustain. I had entered my reign with the confident belief that sound economic policy, administered by competent officials, could ensure prosperity for Roman citizens. This assumption reflected a fundamental misunderstanding about the relationship between intention and outcome in complex systems. Economics, I learned, is largely beyond any ruler's direct control, involving countless variables that interact in unpredictable ways. The economic troubles began gradually. Military campaigns along the Danube required enormous expenditures, not just for weapons and supplies, but for the massive logistical support needed to maintain armies in hostile territory. For years, simultaneously, the plague disrupted agriculture and trade throughout the empire, reducing tax revenues precisely when we needed them most. My advisors presented various solutions: debase the currency to stretch our silver reserves, raise taxes to increase revenues, reduce military expenditures by abandoning frontier defenses, or find new sources of wealth through expanded conquest. Each option carried serious risks, and none offered guarantees of success. I chose what seemed the least harmful path: modest currency debasement combined with increased efficiency in government operations. The decision was based on careful analysis and consultation with experts, yet the results were disappointing. Inflation accelerated beyond our projections, public confidence in Roman currency declined, and the economic hardship spread to affect citizens who had previously been comfortable. My initial response was the familiar pattern of attachment and frustration. I worked longer hours, consulted more experts, demanded detailed reports on every aspect of our economic situation. I felt personally responsible for every merchant who struggled, every family that couldn't afford bread, every provincial city that suffered from reduced trade. This sense of personal responsibility for outcomes beyond my control was creating the same kind of suffering I had experienced in other areas of imperial duty. I was measuring my worth as emperor by economic indicators that were influenced by factors I could not manage, weather patterns affecting harvests, tribal movements disrupting trade routes, diseases spreading through commercial centers. The breakthrough came when I applied the principles of Stoic philosophy to economic leadership. Instead of asking, how can I guarantee economic prosperity, I began asking, how can I respond to economic challenges with wisdom and integrity? This shift moved my focus from outcomes I could not control to choices I could make. I realized that my responsibility was not to prevent all economic hardship, an impossible task for any mortal ruler, but to ensure that our responses to economic challenges were fair, well-reasoned, and aimed at serving the common good rather than protecting narrow interests. When citizens criticized my economic policies, I had to learn not to take their anger personally. Their suffering was real and their frustration was understandable, but my inner peace could not depend on their approval of decisions that were made with the best information available at the time. I discovered that economic leadership, like all other forms of leadership, required what I came to think of as principled experimentation. You gather the best information possible, consult with wise advisors, apply ethical principles to your decision-making, and then implement policies with full commitment while remaining ready to adjust when results differ from expectations. The key was holding this entire process lightly, caring deeply about the outcomes while recognizing that economic systems have their own logic that often defies even the most thoughtful human intervention. Good policies sometimes produced poor results due to unforeseen circumstances. Bad policies sometimes succeeded due to lucky timing. The quality of decision-making could only be judged by the process itself, not by outcomes that were influenced by countless uncontrollable factors. This perspective helped me maintain effectiveness during the economic crisis rather than becoming paralyzed by anxiety about results. When inflation continued, despite our monetary adjustments, I could evaluate whether our response process had been sound and make further adjustments without feeling personally defeated by the initial policy's limitations. I also learned to communicate with citizens about economic challenges in a way that acknowledged both the reality of their hardships and the limits of imperial power. Rather than making promises I could not keep or taking blame for problems that had multiple causes, I focused on explaining our reasoning, demonstrating our commitment to fair solutions, and maintaining hope while avoiding false optimism. The economic troubles never fully resolved during my lifetime. Some challenges proved too complex for any single reign to address completely. But by releasing my attachment to being the emperor who solved all of Rome's economic problems, I was able to contribute what I could while maintaining the inner peace necessary for effective leadership. This experience taught me that complex systems, whether economic, political, or social, have emergent properties that no individual can fully control. Leaders can influence these systems through their decisions, but they cannot determine outcomes with certainty. Peace comes from accepting this limitation, while still engaging fully with whatever influence you actually possess. The economic crisis became another teacher in the University of Nonatum, showing me that even emperors must learn to do their best with incomplete information, and then accept whatever results emerge from forces much larger than any individual will. Asterisk. The letter arrived on a morning when the Danube mist hung heavy over our camp. My trusted general, Avidius Cassius, commanding legions in the east, had declared himself emperor upon hearing false reports of my death. The man I had trusted with the defense of Syria and Egypt, whom I had promoted based on his competence and apparent loyalty, had chosen to rebel against me while I fought barbarians on a distant frontier. Betrayal strikes at something deeper than mere disappointment over outcomes. When someone you trust acts against you, it feels like a fundamental assault on your understanding of human nature and your judgment of character. My initial reaction was a mixture of hurt, anger, and disbelief. How could I have been so wrong? About Cassius? What did this say about my ability to judge people? How could someone I had trusted with such responsibility turn against Rome and against me? The officers around me expected swift and harsh retaliation. Roman tradition demanded that rebellion be crushed mercilessly, that traitors be made examples to discourage future disloyalty. My advisors began planning the military campaign that would be necessary to defeat Cassius's legions and restore order to the eastern provinces. But as I sat alone in my tent that night, staring at the letter that had announced his rebellion, I realized that this betrayal offered me an opportunity to practice the deepest levels of non-attachment. Cassius's actions were completely beyond my control. They had already happened, and no amount of anger or regret could change them. What remained within my control was how I chose to respond. I could respond with the fury and vengeance that seemed natural and expected, or I could respond with the philosophical principles I had been developing throughout my reign. This was a test of whether Stoic philosophy could maintain its integrity even in the face of personal betrayal by someone I had trusted and elevated. My first step was to release attachment to the outcome I had expected from Cassius' continued loyalty and competent service. He was a human being with his own fears, ambitions, and limitations. The fact that I had hoped for better from him did not mean that better was guaranteed. People act according to their own understanding of their circumstances, not according to our expectations or desires. I examined my own role in the situation without the self-torture of excessive blame. Had I given Cassius too much power too quickly? Had I failed to recognize warning signs of his ambition? Perhaps, but these questions were more useful for learning than for self-recrimination. I had made decisions based on the information available at the time, and now I could adjust my approach based on new information. The more profound challenge was releasing attachment to having been right about Cassius's character. I had trusted him, promoted him, defended him to others who had questioned his loyalty. His rebellion seemed to prove that my judgment had been flawed, which wounded my pride as much as his disloyalty wounded my heart. But I realized that attachment to being right about people's character was another form of trying to control outcomes beyond my power. I could observe people carefully, make reasonable judgments about their trustworthiness, and act accordingly. But I could not control whether those judgments would prove accurate in all circumstances. People change, situations change, and pressures can reveal aspects of character that were previously hidden. Instead of seeing Cassius's betrayal as evidence of my failure as a judge of character, I chose to see it as information about the inherent unpredictability of human behavior. This perspective allowed me to maintain confidence in my general approach to evaluating people, while remaining humble about my ability to predict their future choices. When it came to planning my response to the rebellion, I applied the same principles of known attachment. I could not control whether Cassius would come to his senses and surrender, whether his troops would remain loyal to him, or whether our conflict would be resolved quickly or drag on for years. What I could control was the manner in which I conducted this response. I chose to write to Cassius directly, not with threats or condemnation, but with an appeal to reason and an offer of clemency if he would cease his rebellion. I explained that I was still alive, that his revolt was based on false information, and that I bore him no personal hatred despite his disloyalty. This approach shocked my advisors, who expected me to respond with traditional imperial fury, but I realized that my goal was not to satisfy others' expectations of how an emperor should behave when betrayed. My goal was to handle this crisis in a way that reflected my deepest values and had the best chance of restoring peace with minimal bloodshed. The philosophical challenge was learning to forgive without requiring repentance, to release resentment without demanding justice, and to respond with wisdom rather than react with emotion. This didn't mean being naive about Cassius's character or failing to take appropriate defensive measures. It meant separating my response to his actions from my attachment to having him be different than he was. Cassius was killed by his own officers before my letter reached him, which rendered the entire question of clemency moot. But the exercise of crafting a response based on virtue rather than vengeance had been valuable. Regardless of its practical outcomes, it had taught me that I could maintain my principles even when betrayed, that I could respond to disloyalty without becoming consumed by bitterness. The rebellion also taught me about the relationship between trust and attachment. I had trusted Cassius, which was appropriate based on his previous behavior and the requirements of imperial administration, but I had been attached to that trust continuing indefinitely, which was unrealistic given the unpredictable nature of human character under pressure. I learned to continue trusting people while holding that trust lightly, as a reasonable response to current evidence rather than as a guarantee of future behavior. This allowed me to maintain the kinds of relationships necessary for effective leadership without making my inner peace dependent on others never disappointing me. The betrayal became another teacher in the curriculum of non-attachment, showing me that even the most painful human experiences could be opportunities for growth in wisdom and virtue if approached with the right philosophical framework. My body began betraying me in my 40s. Chronic stomach pain, difficulty sleeping, recurring headaches, and a persistent cough that physicians could neither explain nor cure became my daily companions. For a man who had once prided himself on physical vigor and had led armies through grueling campaigns, this gradual decline felt like another form of imperial failure. The initial response to chronic illness is almost always attachment to restoration, desperate hope that the right treatment, the right physician, the right change in diet or routine will restore the body to its former strength. I consulted every medical authority in the empire, tried remedies from distant provinces, and modified my daily routines in countless ways, always hoping that this time I would find the solution that would free me from physical suffering. This attachment to bodily outcomes created a second layer of suffering beyond the physical pain itself. Not only did my stomach ache, but I was also frustrated and disappointed that my stomach ached. Not only was I tired from poor sleep, but I was also anxious about being tired. The mental suffering of attachment to physical comfort often exceeded the actual physical discomfort. The breakthrough came when I applied Stoic principles to my relationship with my own body. I began to see my physical form as something I was temporarily inhabiting rather than something I owned or controlled. Like all material things, bodies are subject to change, decay, and eventually death. Expecting my body to remain always healthy was like expecting the weather to always be pleasant. Fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of physical reality. This shift in perspective didn't eliminate the pain, but it transformed my relationship to it. Instead of experiencing pain as evidence that something was wrong with the universe, I began experiencing it as information about the temporary condition of my physical housing. Instead of raging against discomfort, I learned to observe it with the same detached curiosity I might apply to watching clouds change shape. I developed what I called the discipline of the body, a practice of separating physical sensations from mental interpretations of those sensations. Pain in my stomach was simply pain in my stomach, not evidence that I was failing as emperor or proof that the gods were punishing me. Fatigue was simply fatigue, not a reason to despair about my ability to serve Rome effectively. This discipline required constant practice, especially during acute episodes of pain. When my stomach cramped during important meetings, I had to consciously choose not to interpret this discomfort as a catastrophe requiring immediate resolution. When headaches made it difficult to concentrate on complex policy decisions, I had to resist the temptation to become frustrated with my body's limitations. I learned to work with my physical limitations rather than against them. Instead of pushing through pain and exhausting myself further, I began adjusting my schedule to accommodate my body's needs. Instead of hiding my illness from others, I began acknowledging it honestly while refusing to make it an excuse for failing to fulfill my responsibilities. The most challenging aspect was releasing attachment to how others perceived my physical decline. An emperor is supposed to project strength and vitality, to embody the power and permanence of the state itself. Admitting to chronic illness felt like acknowledging weakness that could undermine confidence in my leadership. But I discovered that honest acknowledgement of physical limitations often increased rather than decreased others' respect. When I stopped pretending to be superhuman and began demonstrating how to handle human frailty with dignity and grace, people seemed to find my leadership more relatable and inspiring rather than less. I also learned to distinguish between caring for my body and being attached to its condition. I continued following medical advice, eating appropriately, getting whatever rest was possible, and taking reasonable precautions to avoid worsening my symptoms. But I held these efforts lightly, as appropriate responses to my situation rather than as desperate attempts to control an outcome that was largely beyond my determination. The physical pain became another teacher in the school of non-attachment. It taught me daily lessons about accepting what cannot be changed while still doing what can be done. It showed me the difference between suffering that comes from unavoidable circumstances and suffering that comes from resisting those circumstances. Perhaps, most importantly, chronic illness taught me empathy for the countless Romans who dealt with physical suffering without access to imperial physicians or the luxury of adjusting their schedules around their limitations. When I could no longer take my own health for granted, I began to understand more deeply what daily life was like for citizens whose bodies were broken by hard labor, poor nutrition, or inadequate medical care. This understanding influenced my policies toward public health, military veterans, and social support for those who could not work due to physical limitations. My personal experience with the gap between effort and physical outcomes made me more compassionate toward others facing similar challenges. Living with chronic illness while maintaining imperial responsibilities taught me that true strength lies not in the absence of physical limitations, but in continuing to act with virtue despite those limitations. The body will age, weaken, and eventually fail, but the capacity for wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance can remain intact regardless of physical condition. By the end of my reign, I had learned to see my declining health not as a defeat, but as an opportunity to demonstrate how philosophical principles could be lived even under conditions of physical adversity. The pain in my body became a daily reminder that attachment to any temporary condition, whether comfort or discomfort, is a source of unnecessary suffering. My physical limitations taught me to focus on what remained within my control: my thoughts, my choices, my responses to circumstances, and my commitment to serving Rome with whatever energy and clarity I possessed. The body was merely the temporary vehicle for these more essential capacities, and its condition need not determine the quality of my character or the value of my contributions. As my health declined and I felt death approaching, I became increasingly preoccupied with a question that had haunted me throughout my reign. What would happen to Rome after I was gone? This concern about legacy, about how my work would be continued or abandoned, remembered or forgotten, became my final test in learning complete non-attachment to outcomes. I had spent nearly 20 years trying to strengthen the empire's institutions, promote just governance, and establish philosophical principles that could guide future rulers. Yet I could see already how fragile these achievements were. Political reforms could be reversed by the next emperor. Military gains could be lost to future invasions. Even the moral progress I believed we had made could disappear if subsequent leaders chose different priorities. My son Commodus, whom the first had designated as my successor, showed disturbing signs of the kind of character that destroys rather than builds upon inherited wisdom. Despite my efforts to educate him in philosophy and governance, he seemed drawn to gladiatorial spectacles, luxury, and the kind of arbitrary power that I had tried to constrain through law and custom. The temptation was to try to control outcomes beyond my death, to establish ironclad systems that would force future emperors to continue my policies, to surround Commodus with advisors who would prevent him from making destructive choices, to create institutional safeguards that would preserve my vision for Rome, regardless of who wielded power after me. But as I contemplated these desires to control the future, I realized they represented the ultimate form of attachment to outcomes. I was trying to extend my will beyond my own mortality, to make my preferences binding on people who would face circumstances I could not anticipate. This was not wisdom, it was the final ego-driven attempt to avoid accepting the limits of human control. The philosophical work required me to release attachment to how history would remember me and how my efforts would be continued. I had to accept that my contributions to Rome were temporary gifts to my own era, not permanent fixtures that could be guaranteed to last forever. Like every emperor before me, I would eventually be remembered only through the stories others chose to tell about my reign. This process of letting go was perhaps the most difficult spiritual work of my life. Everything I had labored to build: the legal reforms, the military organization, the philosophical culture I had tried to be undone by future leaders who had different values and faced different challenges. The plague recovery I had managed might be forgotten. The frontier defenses I had established might be abandoned. Even the Stoic principles I had tried to embody might be dismissed as impractical idealism. I had to learn to find peace with the possibility that most of my work would prove temporary, that subsequent emperors might consider me a footnote in Roman history, and that the empire itself would eventually decline or transform beyond recognition. This acceptance required abandoning the fantasy that any individual's efforts could permanently shape the flow of history. Instead of fighting this reality, I began to see it as liberating. If my legacy was not within my control, then I could focus entirely on doing good work in the present moment without the burden of trying to guarantee its lasting impact. I could serve Rome as well as I was able during my allotted time without making my peace of mind dependent on how that service would be remembered or continued. This shift allowed me to approach the succession question differently. Instead of desperately trying to control Commodus's future choices, I focused on providing him with the best education and guidance I could offer, while accepting that his character and decisions would ultimately be his own responsibility. Instead of creating rigid systems to constrain future emperors, I concentrated on leaving behind examples of principled leadership that might inspire those who were capable of being inspired. I realized that the most authentic legacy I could leave was not specific policies or institutions, but a demonstration of how philosophical principles could be lived under the pressures of supreme power. If future leaders chose to study my reign, they might learn something about maintaining inner peace while bearing great responsibility, about responding to crises with wisdom rather than panic, about treating people with dignity regardless of their status. But even this modest hope for influence I held lightly. Whether anyone would care about my philosophical approach to leadership was not mine to determine. My responsibility was simply to live these principles as fully as I could during my own time, not to control their reception by future generations. The process of releasing attachment to legacy taught me something profound about the nature of meaningful work. When you do good work because it needs to be done rather than because you want to be remembered for it, the work itself becomes more pure and effective. When you're not constantly calculating how your actions will be perceived by history, you can respond more authentically to the actual demands of each moment. I began to understand that true legacy is not something you can control or create deliberately. It emerges naturally from living with integrity and wisdom, regardless of whether anyone notices or remembers. The emperor who desperately tries to ensure his place in history often accomplishes less than the one who simply focuses on serving well, without concern for recognition. In my final years, I found peace in the idea that I was like a gardener, planting trees whose shade I would never enjoy. Some of the seeds I planted in Roman law, administration, and culture might grow into lasting improvements. Others might wither or be uprooted by changing circumstances. My job was to plant thoughtfully and tend carefully while I was able, not to guarantee the eternal survival of every seed. This acceptance of impermanence freed me to focus on what I could actually control: the quality of my daily choices, the integrity of my responses to challenges, and the example I set for anyone who was watching. Whether that example would inspire future leaders or be forgotten entirely was not my concern. My concern was simply to be worthy of the position I held while I held it. After years of philosophical study and practical application, I developed a set of daily practices that helped me maintain freedom from attachment to outcomes. These were not abstract meditations, but concrete techniques that I used every morning and evening to train my mind in the discipline of non-attachment. My morning practice began before dawn, when the palace was still quiet and I could think without interruption. I would begin by holding a small string of wooden beads, each one representing a different aspect of the day ahead that lay beyond my control. As I touched each bead, I would mentally acknowledge one thing I could not determine: the weather, others' responses to my decisions, the outcome of military campaigns, the health of people I loved, the success or failure of policies I had implemented. This practice of systematic acknowledgement served two purposes. First, it prevented me from unconsciously slipping into the assumption that I could control outcomes that were actually beyond my power. Second, it created a sense of mental spaciousness around the day's challenges, reminding me that my peace of mind need not depend on any particular result. After completing this inventory of the uncontrollable, I would shift to what I called intention setting. Instead of planning for specific outcomes, I would clarify the qualities I wanted to embody regardless of what circumstances arose. I might set intentions to listen carefully during difficult conversations, to respond to criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness, to treat each person I encountered as worthy of respect, or to maintain my composure during stressful meetings. These intentions were entirely within my power to fulfill, regardless of external circumstances. Whether a Senate session went smoothly or erupted in conflict, I could still choose to listen carefully. Whether my policies succeeded or failed, I could still treat people with respect. Whether I received praise or criticism, I could still respond with wisdom rather than react with emotion. I developed a specific technique for handling setbacks that I called reframing practice. When something disappointing occurred, a policy failed, an ally proved unreliable, a military campaign suffered reverses, I would spend time finding ways to view the setback as an opportunity rather than as evidence of failure. This wasn't naive optimism or denial of genuine problems. Rather, it was a deliberate practice of looking for what could be learned, how character could be strengthened, or what new possibilities might emerge from unexpected circumstances. A military defeat might teach valuable lessons about strategy. A political setback might reveal the need for better communication with senators. Even personal betrayals could become opportunities to practice forgiveness and to develop more realistic expectations about human nature. My evening practice involved what I called outcome review. Before sleep, I would examine the day's events, paying particular attention to moments when I had become attached to specific results. I would ask myself, when did I become anxious about controlling outcomes today? How did that anxiety affect my effectiveness? What would I have done differently if I had maintained better known attachment? This wasn't self-criticism, but rather honest assessment aimed at continuous improvement. I was training myself to notice the early signs of attachment, the tightness in my chest when a conversation wasn't going as planned, the mental rehearsal of arguments when someone disagreed with me, the fantasy scenarios where everything worked out perfectly according to my preferences. I also practiced what I called gratitude for process. Instead of celebrating only when outcomes matched my preferences, I learned to find satisfaction in the quality of my effort, regardless of results. If I had prepared thoroughly for a negotiation, I could feel grateful for that preparation, even if the negotiation failed. If I had treated someone with kindness, I could appreciate that kindness, even if they responded with hostility. This practice helped me locate my sense of accomplishment in things I could actually control: my effort, my integrity, my growth in wisdom rather than in external validation or successful outcomes. One of my most valuable practices involved what I called temporal perspective. When facing a challenge that seemed overwhelming or when disappointed by an unexpected setback, I would imagine myself looking back on the situation from various points in the future: 1 month later, 1 year later, 10 years later, and from my deathbed. This exercise almost always revealed that problems that seemed catastrophic in the moment would be much less significant from a longer perspective. It helped me maintain proportion and reminded me that most outcomes that seemed terribly important were actually temporary circumstances that would eventually be replaced by new challenges. And RTUNITIES. I developed specific techniques for managing my responses to other people's behavior. When someone acted in ways that frustrated or disappointed me, I would practice what I called character separation, distinguishing between the person's actions and my expectations about their actions. Their behavior was their responsibility. My expectations were mine. Their choices reflected their character and circumstances. My peace of mind reflected my philosophical discipline. By maintaining this separation, I could respond to others' actions appropriately without making my inner state dependent on their choices. For particularly challenging relationships, I practiced loving detachment, caring about someone's well-being, while releasing attachment to controlling their behavior or ensuring their approval. This involved offering support and guidance when appropriate, while accepting that their ultimate choices and character development were beyond my control. These daily practices required consistent effort and regular adjustment based on experience. What worked well during peaceful times often needed modification during crises. The techniques that helped me maintain equanimity as emperor had to be adapted when I became ill or when facing personal losses. The key was treating known attachment as a skill that required daily practice rather than as a philosophical position that could be adopted once and maintained effortlessly. Like physical fitness, mental freedom from outcome attachment required ongoing exercise and attention to maintain. ****. The transformation from outcome-focused living to process-focused living brought me a kind of joy I had never experienced before, the deep satisfaction that comes from engaging fully with effort itself, regardless of what that effort produces. This shift changed not just how I approached my imperial duties, but how I experienced every aspect of daily life. I discovered this joy most clearly during the construction projects I initiated throughout the empire. Previously, I had measured the value of public works by their completion and their reception by citizens. Building bridges, roads, and aqueducts was worthwhile because these structures would serve Rome for generations and would demonstrate imperial competence and care for public welfare. But as I learned to release attachment to outcomes, I began finding satisfaction in the work itself, in the careful planning, the coordination of skilled craftsmen, the solving of engineering challenges, the daily progress toward completion. Whether a particular bridge would stand for centuries or be destroyed by future wars was beyond my control. What I could control was ensuring that it was designed thoughtfully, built with integrity, and completed with attention to both function and beauty. This shift in focus made me more present during the construction process rather than constantly anticipating the finished result. I could appreciate the skill of stonemasons laying a foundation, the ingenuity of engineers solving drainage problems, and the dedication of laborers working in difficult conditions. The project became valuable for what was happening during its creation, not just for what it would provide once completed. I applied this same approach to governance more broadly. Instead of measuring my success exclusively by whether Rome prospered under my rule, I began finding meaning in the quality of attention I brought to each decision, the care with which I listened to advisors and citizens, and the integrity with which I tried to balance competing interests. This process-focused approach made me more effective rather than less. When you're not anxiously attached to specific outcomes, you can think more clearly about what actions are actually helpful. When you're not desperate to succeed quickly, you can take the time necessary to understand complex problems thoroughly. When you're not paralyzed by the fear of failure, you can take calculated risks that might lead to significant improvements. I found particular joy in what I came to think of as anonymous virtue, doing good work that no one would notice. Credit to me personally, ensuring that tax collection was fair in distant provinces, that military supplies reached frontier garrisons efficiently, that judicial decisions in remote cities were based on law rather than favoritism. These efforts brought me deep satisfaction, precisely because they were unlikely to enhance my reputation or be remembered as imperial achievements. The joy of pure effort revealed itself most clearly in my personal relationships. Instead of trying to manage others' responses to me or ensure that conversations went according to my preferences, I began focusing on the quality of my own participation in relationships. I could find satisfaction in listening carefully to someone's concerns even if they ultimately rejected my advice. I could appreciate the effort of trying to understand another person's perspective, even if we remained in disagreement. This approach transformed my relationship with Faustina during the final years of our marriage. Instead of needing her to respond to my affection in particular ways, I found joy in the act of loving itself, in paying attention to her needs, in creating moments of connection when possible, in supporting her through difficulties, regardless of whether she expressed gratitude for that support. I discovered that effort pursued for its own sake, rather than for external rewards, created a kind of internal momentum that made sustained work more pleasant and less exhausting. When you're not constantly evaluating whether your efforts are paying off, you can engage more fully with whatever task is before you. When you're not mentally defending against potential failure, you have more energy available for actual work. The joy of pure effort also helped me handle criticism and setbacks with greater equanimity. When senators opposed my policies, I could find satisfaction in having presented my reasoning clearly and respectfully, regardless of whether I persuaded them. When military campaigns faced unexpected difficulties, I could appreciate the problem-solving process itself rather than becoming frustrated with delays or complications. This shift even transformed how I experienced physical activities. During my younger years, I had exercised primarily to maintain the strength and appearance expected of an emperor. As I learned to focus on process over outcomes, I began finding pleasure in the movement itself, in the rhythmic experience of walking, in the challenge of maintaining balance during sword practice, in the simple satisfaction of stretching muscles that had become stiff from long hours at my desk. I realized that much of what we call enjoyment actually depends on releasing attachment to specific results and allowing ourselves to be present with whatever we're actually doing. The farmer who finds satisfaction in the act of planting, regardless of whether the harvest will be abundant, experiences a deeper kind of contentment than the one who can only feel successful when crops exceed expectations. This understanding helped me teach others about finding meaning in their work. I encouraged administrators to take pride in the thoroughness of their planning rather than measuring themselves solely by whether their plans succeeded. I advised military commanders to find satisfaction in the care they took for their soldiers' welfare, rather than defining their worth entirely by battlefield victories. The joy of pure effort became one of my greatest discoveries as both emperor and human being. It revealed that satisfaction and meaning are available in every moment, not just in moments when external circumstances align with our preferences. It showed me that the highest form of success is not achieving specific outcomes, but engaging fully with whatever life presents while maintaining virtue and wisdom. This joy sustained me through the most difficult periods of my reign and continued to grow stronger as I aged and faced increasing physical limitations. It proved to be independent of health, external achievements, others' approval, or any other outcome beyond my control. It was a source of contentment that no external circumstance could threaten because it was generated entirely from within, through the simple choice to engage wholeheartedly with whatever effort each moment required. Teaching others to release attachment to outcomes proved far more challenging than learning this discipline myself. Intellectual understanding of Stoic principles and lived wisdom are entirely different things, and I discovered that most people resist the very teachings that could free them from unnecessary suffering. My first attempts at teaching non-attachment were clumsy and counterproductive. Early in my reign, when I encountered senators or administrators who seemed anxious about results beyond their control, I would share philosophical insights about the futility of attachment with the confidence of someone who believed that correct understanding would naturally lead to correct practice. I remember one particular conversation with a provincial governor who was desperately worried about a grain shortage in his territory. He had done everything within his power to address the problem, organizing alternative supply routes, implementing rationing systems, appealing to neighboring provinces for assistance, yet he remained consumed with anxiety about whether these efforts would prevent famine. I explained to him the Stoic teaching about focusing on what we can control while accepting what we cannot. I assured him that his peace of mind need not depend on the outcome of his relief efforts, that he could find satisfaction in the quality of his response regardless of results. I thought I was offering him liberation from unnecessary suffering. Instead, my words seemed to increase his distress. He interpreted my teaching as imperial indifference to his citizens' welfare, as philosophical detachment that bordered on callousness. He couldn't understand how someone could care deeply about preventing suffering while simultaneously accepting that suffering might occur despite best efforts. This experience taught me that non-attachment cannot be transmitted through argument or explanation alone. It must be demonstrated through example and discovered through personal experience. People learn to release control not by being told that control is impossible, but by repeatedly encountering the limits of their own power, while witnessing others respond to those limits with wisdom and grace. I learned to teach through modeling rather than preaching. When facing setbacks in public, I focused on responding with composure and constructive problem-solving rather than explaining my philosophical approach. When dealing with criticism or opposition, I demonstrated how to listen respectfully and respond thoughtfully without becoming defensive or attached to changing others' minds. The most effective teaching happened during crises, when people were naturally confronted with the limits of their control. During the plague years, I had countless opportunities to show administrators and citizens how to engage fully with relief efforts while maintaining inner peace about outcomes they could not determine. I noticed that different people needed different approaches to learning non-attachment. Some were naturally drawn to philosophical concepts and could benefit from studying Stoic texts and engaging in theoretical discussions. Others learned better through practical exercise or specific techniques for managing anxiety, concrete methods for separating effort from results, structured approaches to decision-making under uncertainty. The military commanders I worked with often responded well to analogies from warfare and strategy. Just as a good general prepares thoroughly for battle, while accepting that victory cannot be guaranteed, effective leaders in any arena must distinguish between what they can control through preparation and what must be left to circumstances. Beyond their influence, my son Commodus represented my greatest challenge and my greatest failure in teaching these principles. Despite years of philosophical education and countless conversations about virtue and wisdom, he seemed temperamentally incapable of finding satisfaction in anything other than external validation and immediate gratification. I tried various approaches with him: formal instruction, casual conversations, shared experiences designed to illustrate philosophical points, even stern confrontations about his behavior. Nothing seemed to penetrate his fundamental resistance to ideas that would require him to delay gratification or find meaning in process rather than outcomes. This failure taught me, perhaps, the most important lesson about teaching. You cannot force wisdom upon someone who is not ready to receive it. The desire to transform others can become its own form of attachment to outcomes beyond your control. I had to learn to offer guidance, an example, while releasing attachment to whether anyone would choose to accept what I had to share. The people who learned most readily from my example were often those who had already experienced significant losses or failures that had shaken their confidence in their ability to control their circumstances. Administrators who had seen well-planned policies fail due to unforeseen circumstances. Military officers who had witnessed how quickly battlefield situations could change. Citizens who had lost loved ones despite access to the best medical care. These people were already primed to understand the limits of human control. I discovered that the most powerful teaching moments occurred when I could demonstrate grace under pressure in real time, when news arrived of military defeats, when natural disasters struck distant provinces, when political opposition threatened important legislation. People watched carefully to see how I would respond. These moments offered opportunities to model non-attachment in action rather than simply discussing it in theory. My approach evolved toward what I came to think of as invitation rather than instruction. Instead of telling people what they should think or feel, I would share my own experience and observations, then allow others to draw their own conclusions. I might mention how releasing attachment to a particular outcome had helped me sleep better or think more clearly, without suggesting that others should necessarily adopt the same approach. I learnt to recognize when someone was genuinely curious about these teachings versus when they were simply being polite to their emperor. Authentic interest usually emerged from personal struggle, when someone was facing a challenge that their usual methods of control could not resolve. These were the people most likely to experiment with different approaches and to discover for themselves the peace that comes from focusing on effort rather than results. The most effective teaching tool proved to be patient consistency. By responding to challenges with the same philosophical approach year after year, by maintaining equanimity through both successes and failures, by demonstrating that inner peace was possible regardless of external circumstances, I gradually created a model that some people found compelling enough to explore for themselves. I realized that my role was not to convert anyone to Stoic philosophy, but simply to live these principles as fully as I could, and to remain available for those who might benefit from observing or discussing that way of life. The seeds of wisdom cannot be forced to grow, but they can be planted through example and nurtured through patient availability. When others are ready to learn, as I write these final thoughts from my bed in Vindobona, with death approaching and my body failing, I can say with complete honesty that learning to release attachment to outcomes has been the greatest achievement of my life, greater than any military victory, more valuable than any policy reform, more lasting than any monument I have built. The ultimate test of non-attachment is facing your own death, and I find myself remarkably at peace with this final transition, not because I am eager to die, but because I have learned to approach even mortality with the same philosophical discipline I have applied to every other aspect of life over which I have no control. I cannot control when death will come, how much pain I will experience before it arrives, or what will happen to Rome after I am gone. What I can control is how I meet these final days with dignity, with gratitude for the time I have been given, and with continued commitment to the principles that have guided my reign. Looking back over nearly 20 years as emperor, I see now that every challenge I faced was ultimately an opportunity to practice the art of non-attachment. The plague that ravaged the empire taught me that even unlimited resources cannot guarantee protection from suffering. The military campaigns along the Danube showed me that excellent preparation cannot ensure victory. The political opposition I faced in the Senate demonstrated that good intentions and sound reasoning cannot compel agreement. Yet none of these limitations diminished the value of effort itself. The relief efforts during the plague were meaningful regardless of how many lives they saved. The military strategies we developed were worthwhile regardless of which battles they won. The policies I advocated were valuable regardless of which ones gained approval. I have learned that meaning emerges from the quality of our engagement with life, not from our success at controlling life's outcomes. The senator who speaks truthfully, despite knowing his words will be unpopular, demonstrates more virtue than the one who achieves legislative victories through deception. The general who cares for his soldiers' welfare regardless of whether that care leads to battlefield success embodies more honor than the one who wins through cruelty. This understanding has freed me from the desperate need to justify my reign through its external accomplishments. History may judge me as a successful emperor or a failed one, depending on what happens to Rome in the years following my death and which aspects of my rule future historians choose to emphasize. But my worth as a human being does not depend on these judgments, because it was never based on outcomes beyond my control. I have tried to be just in my dealings, even when justice was unpopular. I have attempted to be courageous in facing difficult decisions, even when courage did not guarantee good results. I have worked to be temperate in my desires and wise in my choices, even when temperance and wisdom led to policies that others considered inadequate. These efforts have been worthwhile in themselves, regardless of their external consequences. The character that emerges from consistently choosing virtue over convenience is its own reward, independent of recognition or success in conventional terms. As I prepare to leave this life, I find myself thinking not about what I have achieved, but about what I have learned to release. I have released attachment to being remembered as a great emperor. I have released the need for Commodus to embody the philosophical ideals I hoped to instill in him. I have released anxiety about whether Rome will prosper or decline in the coming centuries. This releasing has not made me indifferent or passive. Even in these final days, I continue to work on administrative matters that need attention, to offer counsel to those who seek it, and to model for anyone who is watching how philosophy can be lived even in the face of death. But I hold all of these activities lightly, as expressions of virtue rather than as desperate attempts to control outcomes I cannot determine. If my final administrative decisions prove wise, I will be grateful. If they prove inadequate, I will trust that others will make necessary corrections. If my counsel helps someone, that is a gift. If it is ignored or forgotten, that too is acceptable. The freedom I have discovered through practicing non-attachment is not the freedom to do whatever I want. That would be license, not liberation. Rather, it is the freedom to respond to each moment with wisdom and virtue, regardless of what that moment contains. It is the freedom to maintain inner peace, whether facing success or failure, praise or criticism, health or illness, life or death. This freedom has been available to me not because I was emperor, but because I was human. The same philosophical principles that have sustained me through the pressures of supreme power are available to anyone facing the challenges of mortal existence. The same practices that helped me maintain equanimity while governing an empire can help any person find peace while managing their own life circumstances. The inner citadel I have constructed within myself is not made of marble and gold, but of acceptance and wisdom. It cannot be conquered by external forces because it is not dependent on external conditions. It has provided me with a refuge that I can access regardless of what storms may rage outside. As I face these final days, I am grateful beyond measure for the opportunity to have lived, to have served Rome as well as I was able, and to have discovered through philosophy a way of being that no external circumstance can threaten. Death may take my body and end my reign, but it cannot touch the peace I have found through learning to focus on what I can control while accepting what I cannot. If these reflections on non-attachment reach anyone who is struggling with their own desperate attempts to control outcomes beyond their power, know this: the freedom I have found is available to you as well. It requires no special talents, no exalted position, no unusual circumstances. It requires only the willingness to distinguish between what you can and cannot control, and the courage to base your peace of mind on what lies within your power, rather than on what lies beyond it. This is my final gift to you, not the promise that you can control the outcomes you desire, but the assurance that you can find profound satisfaction and meaning by focusing on what is genuinely yours to determine: your thoughts, your choices, your responses, and your character. In this realm, you are truly sovereign. and no external force can threaten the peace that comes from exercising this sovereignty with wisdom and virtue. The emperor may die, but these principles are eternal. May you find in them the same liberation I have discovered, and may that liberation serve you as well in your own challenges as it has served me in mine.